There's a building in Midtown Manhattan, 48 floors, glass and steel, completely unremarkable. Just another skyscraper in a city full of them. But inside that building, decisions get made that shape what 330 million Americans read over breakfast, watch before bed, and believe about the world around them. Now picture a family, not a household name, not someone you'd recognize at a grocery store, not someone on Forbes with a smiling headshot. A family that has, for decades, operated almost entirely out of public view. And that's exactly how they want it. Most people think American media is a marketplace, competitive, diverse, democratic even. They're looking at the surface. Beneath it lies something far more deliberate, far more concentrated. And once you see it, you actually cannot unsee it. By the end of this video, you'll understand why the stories you consume, the narratives you absorb, the voices you trust, have all been, to a degree most people never consider, curated by a single bloodline. And here's the part that's almost hard to believe. The acquisition that sealed their dominance, nobody reported on it. Because the people who would have reported on it were already owned. On the surface, American media looks like a thriving ecosystem. Legacy newspapers with Pulitzer Prizes on the wall, cable networks, streaming platforms, digital outlets, podcasts, hundreds of voices, thousands of journalists, millions of stories published every single day. The story we've been sold is competition. NBC versus CBS versus ABC. CNN versus Fox News. The Times versus The Post. These organizations are rivals, we're told. They're fighting for scoops, fighting for ratings, fighting for the truth. The market decides who wins. And for most of the 20th century, that story had some truth to it. Federal regulators at the FCC actively prevented any single company from owning too much. Too many TV stations, too many newspapers, too much reach in a single market. The rules existed because the people who wrote them understood the danger of concentrated media power. Then, quietly, over the course of about 30 years, those rules got dismantled. Loopholes were found, lobbying dollars were spent, mergers were approved, and the landscape that once looked like 100 different voices slowly consolidated into something that looked like diversity, but was in reality control. Most people still think they're choosing between competitors. They're choosing between channels owned by the same architect. So who is that architect? That answer starts with a number. In 1983, roughly 50 companies controlled the majority of American media. Television, radio, print, film, 50 separate ownership structures, 50 different editorial priorities, 50 different reasons to tell a story differently. By 2012, that number had collapsed to 6. 6 companies, controlling roughly 90% of everything Americans watched, read, and listened to. That didn't happen by accident. It happened through a decades-long sequence of acquisitions and regulatory maneuvering that most people never tracked, because the outlets that would have tracked it were already part of the consolidation. But here's where it gets interesting. Behind each of those 6 conglomerates, there's a layer of institutional ownership, hedge funds, private equity, family trusts, that the corporate press releases never mention. And when you follow the ownership structures through the holding companies, the shell entities, the interlocking board seats, a pattern starts to emerge. The same names appear over and over across organizations that are supposed to be rivals. One name in particular shows up with a frequency that's statistically almost impossible to explain as coincidence. A family name that traces back to a single patriarch, a single fortune, and one calculated decision made in the early 1970s. A decision that would take 30 years to fully pay off, and that most of the world still hasn't noticed. The family at the center of this is the Newhouse family. If that name doesn't ring a bell, that's precisely the point. It starts with Samuel Irving Newhouse Sr., son of Jewish immigrants, grew up poor on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. By 17, he was already managing a failing New Jersey newspaper and turning it profitable. He didn't inherit wealth. He built a machine. And then he spent 5 decades quietly buying every piece of media real estate he could find. When S.I. Newhouse Sr. died in 1979, he had assembled a portfolio of 31 newspapers, several broadcast properties, and a private holding company so deliberately structured that it took estate lawyers years to fully untangle. His fortune at the time was estimated at $1.3 billion, one of the largest private fortunes in American history. Almost nobody outside the industry knew his name. That was by design. His sons, S.I. Newhouse Jr., known as Cy and Donald Newhouse, inherited the empire, and they did something remarkable with it. They didn't cash out, didn't go public, didn't bring in outside investors, no quarterly earnings reports, no public shareholders, no exposure. They kept it private, entirely, almost defiantly private. The vehicle for all of it is Advance Publications, a holding company incorporated in Newark, New Jersey, that serves as the invisible spine of the entire empire, privately held, no public financial disclosures, no obligation to reveal the true scope of its holdings to anyone. A fortress with no windows. So what's inside? Start with Condé Nast, the publishing giant that owns Vogue, The New Yorker, Wired, GQ, Vanity Fair, Architectural Digest, Bon Appetit. Every time you pick up Vogue at an airport, read an investigation in The New Yorker, or see a Wired cover shape the tech industry's self-image, you're inside the Newhouse ecosystem. Then there's Reddit, the self-described front page of the internet. Over 1.5 billion monthly visitors. Advance Publications is Reddit's largest single shareholder, a position it secured through a 2006 acquisition that cost around $10 million. After Reddit's 2024 IPO, that stake is worth somewhere in the range of $2 billion. A 200-fold return. Quietly held. Rarely discussed. Then, there's cable. Through a series of transactions in the 90s and early 2000s, the Newhouse family's cable assets got folded into what became Charter Communications. Today, the second largest cable operator in the United States, serving roughly 32 million customers across 41 states. The Newhouse family retains a significant equity stake. That means every time you pay a Spectrum bill, a portion of that payment flows, through several layers of corporate structure, back to Advance Publications. And then there are the newspapers. Dozens of them, operating under the Advance local banner. Regional papers in Cleveland, Newark, Birmingham, New Orleans, Portland. Serving as the primary news source for millions of Americans who've never heard the Newhouse name and have no reason to connect their local paper to a Manhattan media dynasty. Now here's the part people get wrong when they think about how media power actually works. It's not editorial diktat. It's not a phone call from a family member telling a reporter what to write. It's far more elegant than that. It's ownership, the power to hire and fire editors, to decide which publications get investment and which get gutted, to shape institutional culture over decades until the editorial instincts of an entire organization align, organically, with the interests of the family at the top. That's how real media power works. Not through censorship, through architecture. Let's try to put a number on this. Because the architecture we just described isn't just impressive. It's almost hard to comprehend. Condé Nast alone reaches an estimated 1 billion consumers across print, digital, and video globally. 1 billion. That's roughly 1 in 8 people on the planet coming into contact with content produced under the Newhouse umbrella, regularly. Before you count Reddit's 1.5 billion monthly visitors, before you count 32 million charter households, before you count the millions of Americans whose only local news source is an Advance local paper. Add it together, conservatively, and the Newhouse family's infrastructure touches the daily information diet of somewhere between 40 and 50% of the American population, every single day. That's the equivalent of every man, woman, and child in California, Texas, Florida, New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio, combined. And yet the family controlling all of this doesn't appear on political talk shows, doesn't give keynote addresses, doesn't have a verified Twitter account with millions of followers. They exist, for all practical purposes, outside the public eye, which is, genuinely, an extraordinary achievement for people operating at this scale. The political access is equally striking, not through loud public endorsements, through the quieter, more durable currency of access journalism, editorial positioning, and the simple fact that every politician in America understands one thing. You do not antagonize the people who own the paper that covers your campaign. You return their calls. And the reach extends well beyond America. Condé Nast operates fully localized editions in 32 countries. Vogue alone publishes 26 international editions. The cultural architecture the Newhouse family helped build in America has been exported, replicated, and embedded into the aspirational consciousness of the global middle and upper class. This isn't a media company. It's a sovereign information infrastructure, privately held, generationally managed, and almost entirely invisible to the people living inside it. Here is the contrast that defines this family better than any balance sheet. See Newhouse Jr., the man who ran Condé Nast for nearly 4 decades, who personally greenlit the careers of editors like Anna Wintour and writers like David Remnick, who shaped the cultural taste of the American elite, was, by all accounts, a man of almost aggressively understated personal presentation. Rumpled suits, drove himself to the office, ate lunch at his desk. By the standards of his own publications, profoundly unfashionable. And yet, his personal art collection was valued at over $1 billion. Works by Jasper Johns, Willem de Kooning, Cy Twombly. A townhouse on the Upper East Side that occupied an entire city block. He entertained at a level that made the parties his own magazines covered look modest. Public face, a quiet, bookish media executive who just loved good journalism. Private reality, a billionaire whose taste and judgment shaped the cultural output of an entire civilization. Donald Newhouse, Essie's brother, the operational architect of advanced publications, has been even more disciplined about privacy. By most accounts, fewer than a handful of press interviews in his entire career. He controls a fortune estimated at somewhere between $10 and $15 billion, placing him comfortably among the 50 wealthiest people in America. Most people working in the industries he controls couldn't pick him out of a lineup. The family compound in Deal, New Jersey, a quiet enclave on the Jersey Shore, has been the Newhouse base of operations for generations. Understated from the outside, generational wealth made visible only on the inside. This is the Newhouse doctrine. Let the publications be glamorous. Let the editors be famous. Let the talent be celebrated. The family stays in the walls. Power this deep doesn't need a public face. It just needs to endure. Here's what we still don't actually know. The full financial architecture of advanced publications has never been made public. The true extent of the family's equity positions, in Charter, in Reddit, in the dozens of subsidiary entities orbiting the core holding company, has never been fully disclosed, because it doesn't have to be. Private companies in America operate behind a veil that public companies don't, and the Newhouse family has spent a century making sure that veil stays in place. We don't know who comes next. See, Newhouse Jr. died in 2017 at the age of 89. No clearly designated public successor. The next generation has been even more invisible than the last, which, given the family's history, may itself be the answer. We don't know what happens if control is ever seriously challenged. Digital media, the collapse of print advertising, the dominance of Google and Meta, these things have destabilized even the most entrenched media empires. Advanced Publications has adapted. The Reddit investment alone suggests a strategic intelligence that most legacy media companies never demonstrated. But adaptation has limits. And what we don't know, maybe most provocatively, is the full scope of the editorial influence the family has exercised over a century of American journalism. Not through memos, not through directives, through the slow, invisible pressure of ownership itself. That investigation has never been done. Not completely. And the outlets that might do it, you already know who owns them. Every generation produces people who understand something the rest of us don't. That the most durable form of power is never the kind that puts itself on a stage. It's the kind that builds the stage, that owns the microphone, that decides, quietly and permanently, who gets to speak and who gets heard. The Newhouse family didn't conquer American media. They architected it, acquisition by acquisition, generation by generation, until the structure they built became so embedded in the landscape that most people stopped being able to see it at all. That is not an accident. That is a masterclass. So here's the question I want to leave you with. In a democracy that depends on a free and independent press, what does it mean when the press is neither free nor independent, but is instead the inherited asset of a single American family, passed down like a painting or a piece of land? Is that the natural endpoint of capitalism? Or is it the quiet collapse of something we were told would always protect us? Think about that the next time you read the news. If this video made you see something you hadn't seen before, it would meant He World if you hit subscribe. Because these are exactly the kind of stories we tell here. The power structures hiding in plain sight. The dynasties operating just below the surface of everything you think you know. Next time, we're diving inside a family that pretty much owns the entire American economy. And their name is even harder to find than this one. The story never ends. It just gets deeper.